I'm really excited about this subject. It's super cute and super fun, and I hope it gets you in the mood for the holidays. So, for today's lesson, these are all of the supplies I plan on using. You're welcome to pause the video and look for the list of supplies in the video description. However, it's pretty standard for my paintings. I have all of my watercolor paints, a watercolor block, some masking fluid, some opaque white in case I need it, kneaded eraser, rubber cement pickup, and the rest are pretty standard.
The colors I'll be using in today's painting are Pain Fray, Burnt Umber, Burnt Sienna, Cadmium Red Deep Hue, and Ultramarine. You don't need these exact colors, but if you have something close, that will work.
Also in the video description is both a reference photo and a line drawing that you can download. Once you've printed out the line drawing at the scale you plan on painting, on the back of your line drawing, take a pencil and apply graphite all over. Once you've filled in the paper with graphite, position it on top of your watercolor paper so the graphite is touching. Tape it in position, and then trace your line drawing with a ballpoint pen. With simply the pressure of your pen, it's going to help transfer your lines directly onto your watercolor paper. The alternative to using a pencil is to use drafting graphite paper. Simply position it so the darker side, which has all the graphite, is face down on your watercolor paper. You will not have to apply graphite to the back using this method, and simply trace the line drawing again. Just be really careful that you don't apply too much pressure, otherwise your lines may come out real black. Once you've verified that you've transferred all of the essential lines, then you can go ahead and remove your line drawing to begin. I like to use a kneaded eraser before I begin painting to kind of clean up any smudges that may be a result of the transfer. I also make a point to look around the edges of anything that is bright white to lighten up those pencil lines, because I know from experience that even the smallest amount of watercolor wash will lock in those pencil lines and make them permanent. So any pencil lines that are real dark around elements that are bright white, I make a point to soften them just to make sure my pencil lines don't show through in the finished painting. So I'm just taking a kneaded eraser and I'm just going around and tapping the kneaded eraser on any areas where the lines might be a little darker than I would prefer. I'm not so much worried about it around the ears because they are a darker brown. The eyes and nose are also darker, so I don't worry about them too much. But around the rest of the elements, I do choose to soften my colors quite a bit. Before I begin painting today's subject, I want to protect some of the areas that are bright white. So for that, I'm going to use my masking fluid. And in order to protect my brush, I'm going to coat my brush in just a little bit of soapy water. So I've put some dish soap in a small cup of water. I'm going to coat my brush really good. And this will help keep the masking fluid from destroying or drying on my brush. So I'm just going to take this moment to apply masking fluid to my little Santa's hat. I don't want to go too far before re-rinsing my brush in the soapy water. and then redipping my brush in the masking fluid. This is just to protect my tools. I don't want my brush to be ruined with the masking fluid. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. I'm going to re-rinse my brush and redip in my masking fluid and continue. I'm also going to apply some masking fluid to the eyes of my dog. I'm also going to make sure to get some white on the end of the hat. I'm deliberately trying to make the texture of the white uneven on the outside edges. And there's nothing else that really requires masking fluid, so I'm just going to rinse my brush, get all the masking fluid out, and I'm going to go one step further and rinse my brush in my plain water to make sure I don't have any soapy water left in my brush. While that masking fluid is drying, I'm going to take a moment to mix up some of the colors I plan on using. I'm going to use my brush to get as much water on it as it will hold, and I'm going to take my brush over to my palette and drag it across the rim of my palette so it releases a small puddle of water. I'm going to do this in probably 4 different wells to start off. One of my cups of water I tried to use purely for rinsing. The other cup of water I tried to use for making new paint colors. Once I have my water on my palette, I'm going to begin mixing paint for the hat. The first color I plan on using or mixing is a lighter cadmium red. I'm not going to add too much pigment to this color, and I'm going to test it out on a scrap piece of paper. Right now, it looks a little pink, so I'm going to add a little bit more pigment. I do want it to be on the lighter side though, so I'm not going to go too far. That feels a little better. In my next color, I'm going to add quite a bit of this cadmium red because I want this to be a very opaque and bright red for the Santa hat. I'm going to test it out. I'm going to add even more pigment than that because I know from experience that watercolors will dry to be about 20% lighter than what they appear when they're wet. So if you want that vibrant red, you got to be willing to go bold. I'm dragging my brush across the rim of my palette, making sure it's only semi-loaded. That way when I test out my color value, I get a better and more accurate understanding of the value. In my next I'm going to be mixing the cadmium red, but I'm going to be adding some of that ultramarine blue. I want just kind of a dark burgundy red. So I'll be mixing a 75% red or even 80% and just a small 20% of the ultramarine blue to darken it up so it looks more like a burgundy. Before I dip in my ultramarine blue though, I'm going to rinse my brush, get all the red out, making sure to rinse in only one of my water cups so the other one remains clean. And I'm going to get some of that dark ultramarine blue. If I add the right amount, it should just go to a burgundy. If I add too much, it's going to a purple and I need to add more red. I feel like I like this color, however, it's still not as dark as I'd like. So I'm going to add more pigment from both colors, cadmium red and ultramarine, just to make it more vibrant. It's a little more purple than I would prefer, but I think that'll work. The next color I'm going to mix up is going to be just a really soft brown. So I'm going to be using the burnt umber, keeping it heavy on the water. And I feel like that's the right color. In that time, the masking fluid on my hat have dried, so I'm going to apply some clean water just on the forward portion of the hat. So I'm not worried about the back end of the hat just yet. I'm applying clean water to the hat by itself. And I'm making sure to stay inside the lines of that forward section. And I'm being pretty heavy-handed with my water. I'm going to make sure that the water is glossy across that entire area, but I do want the water to be thin enough to see the texture of the paper. I don't want any standing thick puddles. If I do see puddles, I like to use a paper towel or a sponge to dry my brush. Once I have a dry brush, I can tap the surface of any puddles and it's going to absorb that excess water. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to fill everything in with the soft red that I mixed up first. I'm not worried about hitting that masking fluid. I'm just going to run right into it. That's what it's there for. It's going to keep the paint out. This is just layer 1 of my red. While this layer is still wet, I'm going to soak up any excess puddling of paint so I have more control. And then I'm going to grab that dark burgundy red that I mixed up with the ultramarine blue, and I'm going to add some darker reds in just a couple sections of the hat. If I want, I can even add some of that real vibrant red. And I'm okay with leaving some texture in the hat. I think that adds some interest so it doesn't look so flat. Before I move on, I want to rinse all the red out of my brush, dry my brush on a paper towel or sponge, and I'm going to use my dry brush to drag across the wet surface of the hat in the areas where I have folds. This is going to help soak up some of that excess paint that is puddling, so I have a little bit more predictable results. Once I notice the paint is kind of staying in the zones where I would like it, I'm just going to leave that alone and allow it to dry. If I fiddle, then I'm going to risk creating texture and blooms. So I want to get out while everything is still wet. Meanwhile, I'm going to give just a soft brown tone to the entire dog. So I'm taking clean water to my dog, going right over the eyes because the masking fluid is dry. I didn't mask the center of that eye for whatever reason. Apparently I need more coffee, no biggie. The center of that eye is such a dark brown and black that I'm not even worried about it. So if color gets in there, it's no big deal. But I just don't want you to think that was intentional. I'm not doing the tail yet because the tail is sharing an edge with the hat. And until that hat is completely dry, I cannot paint anything that's sharing an edge with it without risking the colors blending and bleeding into one another's space. Now that the entire dog, ears, head, and paws are wet, I'm using my dry brush to soak up any excess puddling of water before I bring in my soft brown tones. Once there's no puddling of water, I can load my brush with that ultramarine blue, and I'm just going to fill in this dog. Notice on the ear, I tried to create some texture following the direction of the hair on the ear. Now that I've filled in that area, I'm going to let it dry. If I am being impatient, I can hit it with a blow dryer to speed up the process. Now that everything is dry, I'm going to add some soft browns to the tail of the dog. The top section of this tail is definitely lighter fur, so I'm going to make sure to have soft pencil lines at the top edge of that tail, just to lower the risk of the edges showing. I'm painting wet on dry simply because this is such a small shape that I feel like I can paint it relatively quickly and not worry about things drying partway. I'm making sure to get some texture on the tail following the direction of the hair growth. While that tail is drying, I'm going to continue working on the Santa hat. I'm switching from my number 8 round to my smaller number 6. And this is such a narrow area, this back portion of the hat, that I'm just going to paint wet on dry using that burgundy. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. While that section of the hat is drying, I'm going to move on to mixing more colors for the dog fur. One color I'm going to mix is going to be that burnt umber, but with less water this time because I want it to be a darker value. I can use a scrap piece of paper to test out my value. And I'm going to add just a little bit of the burnt sienna to warm it up a bit. Once you're happy with your color, you can rinse your brush, get some water to a new area of your palette, and mix another color. In this next one, I am going to use my burnt umber again. However, this time I'm going to add just the smallest amount of ultramarine blue so it darkens it up and gets it closer to a black brown. I'm going to test out my color on a scrap piece of paper. And although I like the color, it's not nearly as dark as I need it. So I'm going to add more pigment to my mixture. More of that ultramarine brown and grabbing some of that ultramarine brown, I mean burnt umber. And then I'm grabbing some of that ultramarine blue. And I feel like that's a little bit more of the color I need. Now in watercolors, we always want to work from our lightest value towards our darkest value last. And we have to hop around, especially when we're painting fur, to give each layer a chance to dry before going on top with the next value. So I'm starting with my lightest value of the burnt umber, which we used as a base color, and I'm just going to get some fur texture in. So right above the eyes, we have some darker fur texture because of the shadow created from the brow. We also have some darker fur texture that is coming down from the forehead. central on the forehead. So I'm just kind of adding that fur without completely filling it in. So I'm allowing there to be some negative space. I'm going to create that darker upper brow area on the opposite eye. And there's also some darker fur that is on the lower portion of the eye, so just above the cheek. And I'm going to do the same thing on both eyes, just darkening it up a little bit. I have to be patient when painting animals because it takes quite a few layers before we get to the results we want. So while those areas are drying, I'm sticking with that lighter ultramarine brown, or I'm sorry, I keep saying that. I mean burnt umber. And I want to come up from the center of the nose and curve out towards the cheek to create the fur that's around the front of our pup. We also have just a few sparing fur textures coming out from the nose on either side. I'm trying not to darken it up too much. So I'm being very sparing and light with my pressure, so my lines are nice and thin and wispy. Whenever I dip in my paint, I drag my brush across the rim of the palette so that it's only semi-loaded with paint. I don't want to overload my brush because that's what creates those wide, thick lines. So if you make a point to remember to drag your brush across the rim of your palette, taking out some of that excess paint, it's going to help you get more wispy, thinner lines in your fur texture. I'm going to create some fur texture on the back portion of the pup. It's a little darker, so I'm going to make a point to be a little heavier handed and allow some of my fur texture to run into each other, giving a little bit more of a dense coverage. I'm always trying to follow the direction and contour of the puppy. Paws are really fun. We have just subtle curves that go over the front toes of the paw. So I'm making sure that I do subtle curved short lines to indicate that same contour. I will be doing this on both feet. If my fur texture runs in the ears, I'm not worried about it. I'm going to also give some fur texture to the back tail of the pup. With this burnt umber, this is still the lighter version. I'm just going to do a glaze on top of the ears of my puppy. Notice how I tried to maintain texture along the outer edges so it always looked like fur. I didn't fill it in and make it look super smooth. I'm going to do the same thing to the opposite ear. Just adding a glaze of that lighter burnt umber that was mixed up. And I'm just doing a second glaze right on top of the ears to improve contrast. I'm now going to rinse my brush and get some of that darker brown that I added the blue to so I can do a glaze over top of the nose. If you feel like you might lose your lines for the nostrils, you can take a pencil and just retrace them if it gives you a little bit more peace of mind that those details won't get lost. Because eventually we will have some darker blacks in this area. But the nose is kind of a focal point. So I just make a point to darken up my lines, and then I can do a glaze of that darker brown right on top of that nose. A nose, just like eyes of any animal, takes multiple layers to get the dimension you want. If I have puddling of paint on the nose, I dry my brush on a sponge or paper towel, and I use my dry brush to soak up the puddling of paint to thin it out so that it dries nicely. While that nose is drying, I'm going to return my attention back to the Santa hat. Everything has dried since the last time, and there are some areas that I feel like now look washed out, so I'm going to add some additional layers. One of those layers will be the burgundy on top of that back section of the hat. I want the color to be really rich and vibrant, so I'm making a point to just do this color right on top of the previous layer. When I get to thin, narrow areas, I make sure to touch a sponge with my brush, sponge or paper towel, to absorb any paint that it might be holding, and it gives me better success at getting into thin, narrow areas. Now, while that back section of the hat is drying, I want to give more vibrancy to the front portion of the hat, considering that fold. I'm going to use very gentle pressure with clean water, and I'm going to apply clean water up to the area of the fold, not coming in contact with that back section of the hat that is still wet. And I'm being very, very gentle, using a quality brush with soft bristles so I don't gouge the previous layers. Now, the reason why I'm applying water is because I want the water to help me create a smooth transition from dark to light in this forward section of the hat. So I'm going to grab the really vibrant cadmium red that is by itself, and I'm going to go through the center portion of this forward section. And I'm tapping my brush so it releases some of that paint, giving me more vibrancy. And because of the water that I have, it's automatically softening, traveling through that water to the edge of the fold and stopping there. And that's exactly what I want. I'm not going to continue that paint over to the left. I want to just keep it on this right side. I'm then going to grab some of that burgundy and just through the very center of this section, I'm going to tap my brush on the wet surface so it releases some of that darker burgundy color to indicate a fold. I'm now going to rinse all the paint out of my brush, dry my brush off on a sponge or paper towel, and I want to just soak up any puddling of paint before I leave that area to dry. While the hat is drying, I'm going to check in on the rest of the pup. The ears still feel cold to the touch, so I'm going to let those ears dry a bit longer before I continue to work on them. However, the other areas of the dog, with the exception of the nose, have dried. So I'm going to get some of the brown with that burnt sienna added, so it's a little bit more of a golden color. And I'm going to be selective and try and create some wispy little hairs that are just above each eye. I like to build up both sides together just so it looks more cohesive in the end. As I'm adding some of this color to the top portion above the eye, I'm making sure to try and follow the contour of that brow bone. I'm going to use some of this color on the center forehead area just below the hat. The lighter the pressure you use, the more thin your line work will be. And remember, don't overload your brush. Wipe away the excess paint so you have more success getting those thin lines. Now, right above the edge of the snout, the fur darkens up towards the edge. So I'm making a point to just get some thin, darker, wispy hairs right along the edge of the snout. And I'm trying to resist the urge to make everything perfect and symmetrical. I'm doing my best to continue following the contour of the hair. Having to switch directions once I get to the right side. When I get to the paws, I'm going to do the same, keeping the darker hair towards the bottom of the paws, because if I bring that up too high, I'm going to lose the contrast between the paws and the darker ears. So I'm being selective of where I darken things up. It won't be everywhere. I'm going to also add a layer of some of these browns to the back portion of the puppy. I'm now going to grab some of that real dark brown that we added the blue to. And the ears are now dry, so I can begin layering some darker hairs on top of the ears. Now the hairs on the ears are quite a bit longer, so my strokes are longer to try and mimic that same texture. But again, I'm still being aware of my negative space, trying not to just fill it completely in. I can use some of this darker brown on the back tail of the pup as well. I just cannot come in contact with the wet section of the Santa hat, because otherwise I risk my colors bleeding together. Continuing with that same color, I'm going to darken up just the center of the head coming down from the forehead. Just a couple of the hairs around the snout. Avoiding the temptation to make everything symmetrical. And the hairs that are just beneath the nose are a little darker. I'm going to add some darker hair textures to the opposite ear, making longer paint strokes. I can also darken up some of the hair that is above and below the pup's eyes. A little bit of darker fur just on the underside of the toes. I'm now going to put water in a new area of my palette and grab some Payne's Gray. I'm going to tint my Payne's Gray with just a small amount of brown, so it doesn't have as much blue to it. And I'm going to add quite a bit of water. I want this to be a very soft gray. I always like to wipe my brush off on the rim of my palette and test out my paint color. I feel like that is still a little too dark than what I'm looking for, so I'm going to water it down further. Making sure my brush is only semi-loaded. And I feel like that's more the value of what I'm looking for. So I want to make sure that I don't have too much paint on my brush so I get thin, wispy lines. And I just want a few lines kind of hinting at fur texture in some of the areas of the head that doesn't have anything just yet. So right above the nose, I'm adding some soft grays. Around the snout, I'm doing it as well, but I'm being very sparing. I'm not heavy-handed at all. I want to keep the fur lighter. Now the tail is more in the background. So I'm going to take a damp brush and I want to just soften some of the detail by applying a little bit of water. So a little bit of water on my brush and moving back and forth over some of the fur texture here will help soften it a bit so it doesn't grab so much of the attention. I want the attention to be on the forward portion of the pup. So I'm just softening the details so it's not so much of a focal point. Now I'm going to put a small amount of water in another area of my well, and this time I am going to go much darker with a mixture of both Payne's Gray and Burnt Umber. I'm going to test out my value. It is much darker. And again, with each layer, as we move to our darker values, I'm being more and more sparing. And I'm slowing down. I'm not going on autopilot. Just darkening up some of the fur gradually. The fur on the ears get quite dark, so it's going to take a number of layers before we get to the value we want. But I always choose to work the layers in slowly so I can create depth and capture all the values. And again, your instincts are to be making the hair symmetrical and perfect. However, it won't read realistic if you give in to that. So try and resist and really take a moment to pause and look at your reference photo to help you determine where to put some of these darker shapes and colors. I'm going to do the same thing on the opposite ear. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. I'm taking a moment to pause just to reevaluate my reference photo. And I'm trying to get some of this darker values that are just below the nose. I'm going to get just a touch of a couple darks on the underside at the paws for contrast. I'm going to check on my hat, see if it's completely dry. It is. So I'm now going to apply some clean water to the center section of the hat so I can darken that up and give it a little bit more vibrancy. So I'm putting clean water on just this center section, being very gentle with my brush so I don't gouge the previous layers as best as I can. Not an easy thing to avoid. Once I have water covering that entire center area, now I'm going to grab some of the burgundy and just above this fold, I want to darken it up. And I don't need to bring that burgundy all the way out to the edge. I can just let it kind of get pulled by the water. Before I walk away, I rinse and dry my brush. And I can take a moment to kind of control how far that paint goes, soaking up any of the excess puddles. A dry brush really helps kind of control things. And then this front bottom left corner, I'm just going to add some water here to soften it so the transition looks a little bit more natural. But I can't keep fiddling because things are beginning to dry already. So I need to just make sure that my edges are nice and clean, and I need to get out quickly before a bloom might happen. So now I'm going to mix some Payne's Gray by itself. And I'm going to switch to my small number 1 round. And I'm going to go into the nose and paint the nostrils. The nostrils of a dog kind of remind me of a Nike swoosh. They're kind of like these little curly cues. And although the nose is not done yet, by painting the nostrils early, it just helps ensure that I don't lose them through the process. So I just did that purely so I don't lose them, and I'm going to come back to it in a little bit. I'm also going to take some of this dark Payne's gray, which pretty much looks like a black, and I'm going to be very selective and in just a few areas apply some darker color to some of the fur. Just darkening up a little bit around the eyes as well. While those areas are drying, I can remove the masking fluid on the eyes. However, considering I just applied some black nearby, I don't want to run the risk of smearing it. So if I need to, for just additional peace of mind, I'm going to hit it with the blow dryer to make sure it's completely dry. Once you've verified everything is dry, you can take your fingers with firm pressure to peel the masking fluid, or you can just use a rubber cement pickup. I'm not removing all masking fluid just yet. I'm just focusing on the eyes for now. I'm going to use my small #1 round. I'm going to get some of that dark brown that I added some Payne's gray to. And I'm going to do a layer on just the iris of the eye. I'm going to do the same thing on the opposite side. Now the back portion of the hat, we can add a little bit of tint to the coloring of white so it doesn't camouflage in with the background. So while those eyes are drying, I can take my rubber cement pickup and lift the masking fluid from both sections of the hat. Sorry about the camera shaking while I do this. Making sure I don't run into the eyes when I brush the masking fluid crumbs away. Now I'm going to get my brush, my large one, put some water in a new area of my palette, and I'm going to grab the smallest amount of Payne's Gray to make a soft, watered down gray. Now I want this to be very, very light, very close to white, and I feel like that is exactly what I want. So I'm going to use this color to give some value to the back section of the hat. And I'm making a point to kind of tap and wiggle my brush around the outer edge so it doesn't look smooth and perfect. While that area is drying, I'm going to rinse the color out of my brush, and I'm going to apply clean water to the forward section of the hat. I'm getting as close to the edge as I can without going outside of it. And all around the edges, I'm now going to use my small brush with that watered down gray. I'm going to give just the littlest bit of value to my whites. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. I can take this really soft Payne's Gray and create some shadows if I want underneath my pup. Just real subtle because I don't want it to draw attention away from my puppy. I try not to let puddles of paint sit. While the shadow is drying as well as the hat, I'm going to do another layer on the eyes. I'm going to get a really dark Payne's Gray for the pupil. In the beginning, this is going to look really weird, but we just keep up with the layers and eventually the eyes always come to life. So until we get reflections and additional details into the eyes, they look very much like a cartoon. But I'm now going to take the dark black that I have and I'm just going to give more definition to the upper eyelid. So I'm trying to create thin line work just above the eye. And I'm going to do that to both sides. I'm going to do this also for on the bottom. I'm going to continue using my small brush and I'm going to get some more definition on the nose. So right at the top of the nose, I'm using that Payne's Gray. And I'm doing kind of this half moon shape. Right now, that hard edge on the front side of the nose looks odd, but we're going to soften that after it kind of dries a bit. I'm going to do this darker black on the lower half of the nose as well. Now I'm going to take a damp brush and I'm just going to soften that transition. So I'm just dragging my damp brush across that edge. Same with on the bottom of the nose. I'm not pressing hard. I'm being really gentle so I don't gouge the layers. While those areas are drying, I can return to the eyes and continue building my detail. So I'm going to get some of that brown that we added the burnt sienna to. And I'm just going to add a little bit of texture to the iris. And I have to let that dry. Meanwhile, I'm going to take some of this bleed-proof white into a section of my palette that hasn't been used. And for now, I just want opaque white with the tiniest bit of brown to tint it. So I'm going to show you the color I'm working with. So it's just a little bit of tint to my white. And I'm now going to be very selective and I'm going to go through just a few areas along the cheek, to give some highlights on the upper brow. To the fur that's kind of inside between the eyes. It's okay if some of it comes in contact with the eye because that will actually make it look a little bit more natural. And when we first put this color on, it looks really, really vibrant, but it will dull a bit as it dries. So I'm not worried about that. So if I feel like some of the color that I put down got a little too carried away and dark, this is when I can kind of add back some of those highlights that I might have lost. And you can do this with a titanium watercolor or a gouache. Just make sure that it is a watercolor gouache and not acrylic. So again, the goal is just to go through and be selective and add a few highlights. Now I'm going to get some more of that bleed-proof white, but this time I'm not going to tint it. I'm going to leave it as just opaque, bright white. And I'm going to be very selective and light-handed, making my lines wispy as much as possible. Sometimes I tap my sponge or paper towel to make sure my brush isn't overloaded with the white because I don't want these big, thick, wide marks. Trying to bring emphasis to some of those brow hairs. If something like this occurs where you accidentally get a wider line than you expected, the benefit of watercolor, gouache, or bleed-proof white is it does get reactivated just with a damp brush, so you can kind of thin it out and fix it. I'm also going to use this bright white to add some texture to the hat now that it has dried. Because we put such a soft gray down, we won't be able to see the texture real well, but just a hint of it can just help give a little bit more realism to it. I'm not going to worry about the back section of the hat because that's more a background element. So I'm keeping all of my texture and details to the focal point area. Now I'm going to get some of the ultramarine blue and tint my white. And I'm going to use this to create a highlight on the eye. I'm going to remove the tinted blue from my brush and get more of the opaque white. I'm going to grab some of that tinted white that I added the slightest bit of brown to. I'm just going to add a little bit of fur texture to the top of the nose. I can also use this tinted brown to put little dots and highlights on the nose. And then I always like to get a real rich black for the nostrils to finish them up. Because throughout the layers, they kind of lose their definition. And right through the center lower half of the nose, there's always like a little crease that I like to paint. And one more detail on the eye. I want to get that really dark brown that I added some of the Payne's Gray to. And just on the outside of the iris, I just want to darken it up a bit. Making sure the blacks that are around the eye are as vibrant as I would like them to be. But I think that concludes our little holiday puppy. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I hope you have a fantastic holiday.